Reckoner tactician Velan Sar found the opening the way a musician finds a wrong note in someone else's playing, which is to say instantly, and with a small involuntary pleasure that he was not proud of and had never managed to suppress. He was standing on the flag bridge of the heavy cruiser Aumdao, at the mouth of the region the human charts called the Straits, and he had just been handed the enemy's dispositions, and there, plain as a misplaced word, was the gap. The throat, the fast passage through the Straits, the one route by which his squadron could overhaul the human convoy before it cleared into open space and scattered beyond catching, was open. Lightly held. A picket, a few light hulls, nothing that would trouble 30 heavy Accord warships for more than a few minutes. It had taken 4 days of real running to reach this moment, 4 days of ordinary visible war, because the Straits could not be fought the way Sar preferred to fight anything. Elsewhere in Accord space a squadron dropped under the seam and crossed 100 worlds in the time it took to finish a report, and a tactician's whole art was played out in projections and intercepts long before either fleet ever shared a common sky. Not here. The underseam went shoal through this entire region, a knotted reef of a thing that would open a hole like a tin can to any ship foolish enough to try to slip beneath it, and so the whole engagement had to be fought the slow way, the old way, hull against hull in the light of ordinary stars, at ranges close enough that a good long glass showed you the paint scheme on an enemy hull before it showed you the shape of her guns. Sar did not mind it. He had spent 4 days shadowing the convoy's flotilla through the Straits' rock-choked reaches, watching how it handled itself at close range under real fire, and he believed, with the quiet pride of a man who trusts his own methods, that those 4 days had taught him a great deal about the woman commanding it. Sar studied it, and the pleasure faded into something more like tenderness, because he understood at once what he was looking at, and it was the saddest kind of tactical decision, the kind a commander makes when she has run out of good options and started choosing between bad ones. They have abandoned the throat, he told his bridge, and he told it the way he told everything, aloud, teaching, because a tactician who does not narrate his reading is wasting the education of his officers. Look at it. The convoy is slow, refugee hulls, overloaded, no acceleration to speak of. Their flotilla is light and it is all they have. If they mass it to hold the throat, they lose it, every ship, because we outweigh them past any hope, and then they have nothing left to screen the convoy in the open. So their commander has done the arithmetic every commander does. She has decided her flotilla is worth more alive, later, than dead, now, holding a passage she cannot hold. She has pulled her strength back to preserve it, and left the throat to us, and she is praying we are slow. It is the correct decision. It is what I would do. It is what anyone would do who has ships worth saving and the sense to save them. His flag captain, a steady Orisk named Damsel, looked at the board. Then we take the throat. Then we take the throat, Sar agreed, and we catch the convoy in the open on the far side, and this is over by second watch, and I will feel a little sorry about it, because a commander who reads the board that clearly deserved a better hand to read it with. He almost smiled. Signal the squadron. We drive the throat. Order of battle for a light picket. And someone note for the record that the enemy commander, whoever she is, made no mistake today. She simply did not have the ships. That is not a defeat you can be ashamed of. Range to the throat, 800 marks in closing. This is the story of the most elegant reading of an enemy that Velan Sar ever made, and of how it was exactly right in every particular except the one that mattered, and of the woman on the other side who built the whole trap out of nothing but his certainty that she would want to live. I want you to keep one thing in your mind as you watch the range close, because Sar could not keep it in his. He had read a commander protecting her ships. He had not considered, because his whole science gave him no reason to consider, that he was reading a commander who had already decided to spend every one of them. Cas Ilif had never wanted to command anything, and had spent a whole life arranging not to, and was now in command of 16 ships and about 4,000 lives because everyone better at it was dead or gone, and that was the frontier for you. It handed you the thing you had spent your life dodging precisely at the moment you could no longer dodge it. She was a smuggler. That was the honest word, and she used it, because the dishonest words, free trader, independent operator, were for people who had not made their peace with what they were, and Cass had made her peace with it a long time ago. A smuggler's whole art is knowing how the people with the guns think, so you can be somewhere they are not, and Cass had spent 20 years studying the Accord the way a mouse studies a house, and she knew things about how the Accord thought that no human admiral in a proper uniform had ever bothered to learn, because the admirals were busy thinking about how to fight the Accord, and Cass had only ever needed to think about how to slip it. Which was why, when the colony at Weller's Reach got its clearance notice, the polite Accord letter that meant leave or be folded, and everyone knew by now what folding a human world actually cost, and the evacuation flotilla found itself with no one to command it who understood the enemy, the job had rolled downhill, the way jobs do, until it hit the one person on the Reach who knew the Accord from the inside of its blind spots. Cass Iliff. Smuggler. Who owed the dead a debt she had spent years not paying, and whose chance to pay it had just arrived in the shape of 4,000 people who needed to cross the straits, and one Accord squadron coming to make sure they never did. The debt had a shape, if you pressed her on it, though she rarely let anyone press. A long time back, on a run that had gone bad the ordinary way runs go bad, Cass had chosen her own hide over a partner's, cleanly, without much agonizing, because that was the trade she had always understood herself to have made with the universe. She ran, she did not fight, and the not fighting was what kept her alive to regret things instead of dying young and clean about it. The partner had not made it. Cass had told herself for years that there had been no other math available, and had almost believed it, and had built, on top of that almost believing, the entire practice of a life spent making sure she was never again the only person who could have stayed and hadn't. She would have told you, if you'd asked, that Weller's Reach was just the job that had landed on her. She would have been lying, a little, in the specific way people lie about the debts that actually run their lives. Talk me through it again, said her second, a Weller's Reach dock boss named Terrace who had appointed herself Cass's conscience and quartermaster on the same afternoon. Slow. Because what you're describing sounds like we open the front door and invite them in. That's exactly what we do, Cass said. Cass. Listen. Cass pulled up the chart, the straits and the throat and the slow bright cluster of the convoy already 3 hours into its crossing. You can't fight 30 heavy hulls with 16 light ones. That's not a battle, that's a rounding error. So we don't fight them. We think about how their tactician reads a board, and we give him a board that reads the way we need it to read. And here's the thing about their tacticians, the thing I have bet all 4,000 of these lives on, they are brilliant, and they are certain, and the certainty is the crack. They have one law under everything they do, and the law is that the enemy wants to live. Every read they make starts there. Faced with a choice, the enemy takes the move that keeps the most of itself alive, because that's what a thinking thing does, in their book. It's such a deep assumption they don't even know it's an assumption. It's just the water they swim in. And it's wrong. It's not wrong, Cass said, quiet. That's the awful part, Terrace. It's not wrong about most things. A smart commander does try to keep her ships alive. If I were the person their tactician thinks I am, pulling the flotilla back to save it would be exactly right, and leaving the throat open would be the sad, sensible thing a beaten commander does. She looked at the chart. But I'm not the person he thinks I am. Because I already decided, this morning, before any of this, that these 16 ships are not going to survive today. I decided it and I didn't tell the crews because they'll figure it out when it's time and I couldn't stand to watch them carry it for the hours in between. We are not pulling the flotilla back to save it. We are pulling it back to hide what it's doing. And what it's doing is rigging the throat to close. Terrace was quiet for a long moment. You're going to spend all of them. I'm going to spend all of them, Cass said, and heard how flat her own voice was, and hated it, because flat was how you sounded when a thing was too big to let yourself feel it yet. To sell a lie to a man who is too good at his job to disbelieve it. He's going to look at us pulling back, and his whole beautiful certain science is going to tell him we're trying to live, because that's what he knows enemies do, and he's going to drive his heavy squadron into the throat expecting a picket. And we're going to be waiting, and we're going to shut the door behind him with our own hulls if we have to, and 4,000 people are going to cross the straits over the bill for it. That's the plan. It's a butcher's plan. I've run it 40 ways and it's the only one that gets the convoy through, and I would give anything for it not to be, and it is. She looked at her 16 ships on the board, each one a crew, each one a set of names she had made herself learn because you do not get to spend people you have not learned. 16 ships was not a fleet. It was barely a number, and Cass had made herself stop thinking of it as one, because a number does not keep you up at night and a name does. There was the low water, a converted ore tender that Lauren Fitch had been running cargo on since before Cass had bothered learning the Accord's name for anything, crewed by 8 of Fitch's own people and a promise he had made his wife, before the Reach's clearance notice ever came down, that he would always be careful, a promise Cass had heard him make once, years ago, in a dockside bar, and had never had the heart to tell him he was not going to be able to keep. There was the steady hand, Aggie Marsh's old coastal hauler, a gun bolted to her hull that had never in its life been fired at anything but drifting debris, crewed by 4 of Marsh's own cousins and a boy Marsh had taken on 2 years back out of plain pity, who had turned out, against every expectation anyone had ever had of him, to be the best gunner in the flotilla. There was the tallow light, small and fast and Corvinday's whole pride, the one hull in the 16 that could actually have run for it and lived, which was exactly why Cass had already decided, in the privacy of her own planning, where in the throat it was going to sit. And there was the Marta's Grace, which was Cass's own, named for a woman who had pulled her out of a very bad scrape 20 years back and was long dead now of something that had nothing to do with the Accord at all, and it was, of the 16 ships on the board, the one Cass had the least right to spend and the one she had already privately decided would go first. She knew all of it, the rivets, the crews, the debts each captain owed her and the ones she owed them back, because a smuggler learns a hull's worth the way other people learn scripture, and because she had made herself walk every deck and learn every name in the 6 days since Weller's Reach, on the theory that if she was going to spend these people she would at least do it awake, as herself, knowing exactly what the coin in her hand was made of. Name the odds, Tara said, gently, because she knew Cass's habits. Terrible, Cass said. Every one of them terrible. And then she did the other half of the smuggler's habit, the half that had kept her alive 20 years, which was to name the odds and then set them down and go anyway. Signal the flotilla. We pull back from the throat. Make it look like fear. Make it look exactly like 16 frightened ships deciding to live. And get me the rigging teams. We've got a door to build. The false retreat took the better part of a day, and Cass Iliff spent almost none of it retreating. She left the visible flotilla to Terrace, with orders to make the pullback look exactly as bad as it in fact was. 16 light hulls falling back before 30 heavy ones does not need dressing up, it only needs someone disciplined enough not to run it a hair too fast, and took a workboat of her own down into the throat itself, because the rigging was not a thing Cass was willing to order done and not watch done. The throat by the system's gray far light was a canyon of black rock a little over 200 marks long and, at its narrowest reach, barely wide enough for 3 ships to pass abreast, and it had taken the engineers of Weller's Reach the whole of the retreat's cover to fill it with what Cass had asked for, which was everything. 3 of the flotilla's oldest ore tenders, hulls too slow to matter and too far gone to be worth saving, were stripped of anything a living person might need and walked, empty, on remote control, into the deepest part of the narrowing, where charge crews had already packed their holds with reactor mass and whatever demolition stock the colony's own mining operation had left behind, the same stock, Cass thought once, grimly, and did not say aloud, that Weller's Reach would have used to blast its own, or if the Accord's clearance notice had given the colony another season to go on being a colony instead of a debt called an early. Mines went into the surrounding rock by hand, seated by suited crews working shifts long enough to run their thruster packs down to fumes, wedged into crevices that would read to any passing scanner as natural stone until the one moment it very much was not. And at both mouths of the throat, dark, engines cold, running no signal a sensor sweep would read as anything but drifting wreck, sat the ships Cass had not sent back with the visible retreat, the fastest hulls she had, the ones with something like a chance of surviving the door once it closed, positioned to do the one thing a beaten flotilla is never supposed to do, which is come forward. Cass worked the rigging herself for 6 hours straight, in a suit, in the cold, because a captain who gives an order like this one and then sits somewhere warm has, in her own private accounting, already forfeited the right to have given it. She knew most of the names of the crews doing the actual welding and the actual charge setting by the second hour, because she made herself learn them the way she made herself learn everything that mattered, and she found, working alongside them, that the worst part of the day was not the mines or the cold or the 12-hour shifts. It was how good the miners were at it. Weller's Reach had been 3 generations digging that moon, and its people knew rock and charge and structural collapse the way SAR's own gunnery officers knew a firing solution, and it took Cass the whole of that day to admit to herself what she had already known in the dark of her own cabin when she first drew the plan up, that the only reason any of this could work at all was that these were not soldiers playing at demolition. They were miners doing, one last time, exactly the job they had always done, at a scale meant to make sure nobody ever asked them to do it again. The oldest of the charge crews was a broad, quiet blasting foreman named Petra Hale, 40 years in the deep galleries of Weller's Reach before the clearance notice ever came, and she walked Cass through the wiring of the last scuttled tender with the patient, faintly bored competence of a woman who had set more charges in her life than she had ever bothered counting, and saw no particular reason this one should be different, except that this one, she said without any drama in her voice at all, was the first she had ever set to kill people on purpose rather than move rock. Rock doesn't mind either way, Hale said, checking a lead twice out of pure habit. I expect it's the same wiring. Cass had no answer for that, and did not try to find one, and simply thanked her, and Hale nodded and went back to work, because there was more rigging to finish and the day was not going to wait for anyone's feelings about it, including her own. Terrace found Cass in the 4th hour, suited, her hands raw from handling cold cable, and said the thing Cass had been waiting for someone to finally say out loud. You could still call this off. Pull everyone back, run for the far exit, let the convoy scatter and hope the Straits swallow enough of the pursuit to matter. I know, Cass said. Are you going to tell me to? Terrace was quiet a moment, watching the suited crews work a mine into a crevice by hand, unhurried, competent, the way people work when the panic has already been used up. No, she said finally. I did the arithmetic myself, twice, hoping I'd land on a different answer than yours. I didn't. I just wanted to hear you say out loud that you knew there was still a door out of this, before you shut the only one that matters. Cass looked at her a long moment. There's always a door out, she said. That's not the same as there being one I could live with taking. Loren Fitch brought the low water up to the throat's near mouth himself rather than send her back with the visible retreat, because Fitch had done the arithmetic on his own converted ore tender and decided, without being asked, that a hull built to carry rock was better spent helping shut this door than kept running another season on borrowed time, and Cass had not had it in her to argue, because he was right, and because arguing would have meant pretending she had a version of this plan that did not need the low water. Aggie Marsh's boy gunner ran a full diagnostic on the steady hands one gun 3 separate times in the last hour before positions were called, not because the gun needed it but because his hands needed something to do that was not waiting, and Cass let him, because she understood exactly what that was for. Corvin Day brought the tallow light in last, fast and quiet, and took up the position at the throat's far mouth that Cass had already picked for her back on the first day of the plan, the one position in the whole rigging with something like a chance of getting clear once the door was shut, because the tallow light was fast enough that Cass had allowed herself, privately, one small dishonest hope that at least that crew, at least those 6, might see morning. By the time the last mine was seated and the last dark hull found its mark, the visible flotilla under terrace had pulled back the length of a full watch, in good order, exactly as frightened as it was supposed to look and not 1 degree more, and somewhere out past the strait's mouth of Elfani tactician was already reading that discipline and beginning, very quietly, to wonder about it. Cass did not know that yet. She only knew that the door was built, that it was the finest work she had ever asked anyone to do, and that she was going to have to stand inside it when it closed. The Ondels Bridge at 600 marks was a familiar kind of quiet, the low disciplined hum of a crew that trusted its tactician completely, screens full of a battle unfolding exactly on schedule, the faint metallic chill of a heavy cruiser running its systems just hard enough to notice and no harder. SAR liked this part of any engagement best, the long unhurried middle of it, when the shape of the fight was already decided in every particular except the arriving, and all that remained was watching the decision arrive. The range to the throat was 600 marks, and Velan SAR was enjoying himself in the quiet, guilty way he always did when a battle was going exactly as he had read it, when the first small wrongness touched the edge of his attention. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. It was the way the human flotilla was pulling back. SAR had spent a long life reading the postures of retreating enemies, and a retreat has a grammar, and the grammar of this one was very slightly off. A commander pulling her ships back to preserve them retreats greedily, she wants distance, she wants it fast, she opens the range as hard as her worst engine allows, because every mark of separation is a ship she gets to keep. But the human flotilla was pulling back at the pace of its slowest hull, in good order, holding formation, not running so much as withdrawing, the way you withdraw when you have somewhere specific to be and are not, in fact, afraid. "Captain Damsel," SAR said slowly. "Watch how they pull back. Tell me what you see." Damsel watched. Orisk were not tacticians in the Velfani sense, but a good flag captain has a soldier's eye, and Damsel had a very good one. "They're not running," Damsel said. "They're repositioning. That's a fighting withdrawal, reckoner. That's not a commander saving her ships. That's a commander moving them somewhere." SAR pulled up the intelligence file on the flotilla's commander while he watched the withdrawal continue, because a tactician who does not know who he is reading is only guessing with better manners. There was not much in it. A smuggler, the file said, elevated to command of the Weller's reach evacuation by the plain arithmetic of everyone more qualified being dead, 20 years running goods and sometimes people past accord patrols, and never once, so far as anyone had troubled to document, standing to fight when running was available to her instead. It had been, when SAR first read it, the most reassuring line in the whole file, because if there was one kind of person in the galaxy reliably certain to value her own survival above a doomed gesture, surely it was a smuggler. Smugglers did not spend themselves. Smugglers ran, and ran well, and lived to run again. He turned the file over now, looking for the seam in that comfort, and found that it would not come apart in his hands no matter which way he turned it, and that the not coming apart was beginning to feel less like confirmation and more like a held breath. And Velan Sar felt, for the first time in a career built on never feeling it, the specific cold of a man who has read a board correctly and is beginning to suspect that the board was written for him to read. He made himself slow down. This was the discipline of his craft, the thing that separated a reckoner tactician from a mere clever officer. When the picture wobbles, you do not lunge, you read-arrive. So he read-arrived. He laid out the enemy commander's situation again, cleanly, from the beginning. She has 16 light hulls and a slow convoy. She cannot hold the throat. Her rational move. And there he stopped, because he had caught himself, mid-word, leaning his whole weight on the word rational, and for the first time in his life he turned around and looked at the word instead of standing on it. Rational meant self-preserving. His entire read, the abandoned throat, the sad sensible retreat, the commander saving her ships for a later that would never come, every piece of it rested on the assumption that the enemy commander valued her flotilla's survival, and would act to secure it, because that is what a thinking commander does. It was the deepest floor of his science. It was so deep he had never once, in a lifetime of reading enemies, thought to check whether he was standing on it. He tried, in the handful of seconds his own doctrine allowed him, to run his memory back across every engagement of his career for a single instance of this floor cracking before, and could not find one, because every enemy he had ever read had wanted, in the end, to live, and had proven it by folding. And the axiom and the proof had never once come apart far enough for him to notice they were two different things wearing the same coat. He thought, absurdly, of a lecture he had once given to a hall of young officers on the elegance of assuming rationality in an opponent, how the assumption let you model an enemy without ever needing to understand her, how it did the labor so the tactician did not have to guess at a stranger's grief or hope, only at her arithmetic. He had been proud of that lecture. He understood now, watching the range close under Damsel's calm reporting, that he had spent a career being proud of a shortcut, and that the shortcut had just walked his lead division into a canyon on legs of its own making. "Reckoner," Damsel said. "Range to the throat, 400 marks. The lead division is committed to the passage. If we're going to alter, it needs to be now." Sar looked at the throat on his board, at the light picket, at the open door his whole beautiful reading had told him to walk through. And he understood, with a scholar's horror, the shape of the question he had never asked: what if the commander does not value her ship's survival above the convoy? What if she has already decided to spend them? Then the retreat is not a retreat. Then the open throat is not an abandonment. Then the light picket is not a picket. Then everything I have read as the sad arithmetic of a commander trying to live is instead the careful staging of a commander who has decided to die, and I have driven the heavy half of my squadron into the one place a dying enemy would most want it. "Halt the advance," Sar said. "Halt the advance. Recall the lead division from the throat, now, flank speed, get them out of the dash. Range to the throat, 200 marks." The lead division was already inside. Cass Ilif sprang the trap from the bridge of a scuttled ore hauler wedged into the rock at the narrowest point of the throat, because she had decided that if she was going to spend her 16 crews she was not going to do it from somewhere safe, and there was no safe place in what was about to happen anyway. She had built the trap the way anything gets built on the frontier, badly, quickly, out of whatever the moon and the desperate would give her, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for 30 heavy hulls to finish walking into it. The waiting was its own kind of work. Cass sat with Terrace in the dark of the hauler's stripped bridge, the low water and the steady hand holding dark and silent at the near mouth, the tallow light farther out at the far one, and she watched, on a passive board that gave off no light of its own to give her away, the lead Accord division come on exactly the way a confident squadron comes on through a passage it believes is lightly held, in good order, division keeping station, unhurried, the ships of a tactician who had already Decided he understood the shape of the night. "They're all the way in," Tara said, low, at her shoulder. "Not yet," Cass said. "Let them get greedy with it. Let him think it's already won." She had run this exact minute 40 times in her head in the 6 days since Weller's Reach, and every time she had believed she would feel something enormous when it finally came, and instead she felt her own pulse, ordinary and fast, and the cold of the hauler's dead heating system, and Tara's breathing beside her, and nothing else, because there was no room left in her for enormous feelings, only for the next decision. She waited until the lead Accord division was committed past the point of return. She watched their own beautiful discipline carry them in, exactly the ships a confident squadron sends through a passage it no longer respects, and then she gave the order she had been carrying since morning, the order she had not told the crews about, and the crews took it without a word because by then they had all figured it out, the way she knew they would, and not one of them broke, because there was no one thing in all 16 crews that breaking could have reached. They closed the door. Cass felt it before she understood it, the way you feel weather before you can name it, the ore hauler's hull ringing with something transmitted through the rock itself rather than through any sound a person's ears were built for, a shudder that came up through the deck plates and into the soles of her boots and did not stop when she expected it to stop, and then a second shudder on top of the first, and a third, each one closer, until the whole hulk she sat in seemed to be one long-held note of grinding stone. She had rigged this. She had asked for exactly this. It was still, in the moment of it actually happening, larger than anything she had let herself imagine while she was asking for it. "I am not going to give you the range readings for this part, because Sar gave them to himself for the rest of his life and that is enough. What happened in the throat was quick and total and does not want describing beat by beat. The scuttled hulls went up. The rock came down. The narrow passage that 30 heavy warships had needed to be a passage stopped being one, in fire and tumbling stone, with the lead division inside it and the rest of the squadron sealed out, and Cass-Ilif's 16 ships spent themselves against 30 in the dark, and did not survive it, most of them, because you cannot close a door that size and stand clear of it. The signals came out of it one at a time, the way everything about that night came in pieces instead of all at once. The low waters went first, and Cass heard Lauren Fitch's voice on it for perhaps 4 seconds, calm, reciting a set of coordinates to no one who could still use them, and then nothing. The steady hands gun, the one Marsh's boy had checked 3 times for nothing, fired for longer than Cass would have believed a single hull could sustain against that much mass, and then that signal went too. The tallow light, fast and lucky and positioned exactly where Cass had privately hoped it might get clear, did not get clear. Its signal came apart somewhere in the tumbling rock with the others, and Cass understood, hearing it go, that she had been wrong to let herself hope even that much, and that the hoping had been its own small selfishness. A comfort she had allowed herself at day's crew's expense without ever asking them whether they wanted to carry it. Then, for a while, there was nothing on the board at all, no signals, no wreckage readings, nothing but the settling dark of a canyon that had just stopped being a passage, and Cass sat in that nothing and understood that she was listening, absurdly, for a sound that space does not carry and never had, the sound of 16 ships finishing. Cass survived. That was the cruelty she had not planned and could not have planned, that the smuggler's luck which had kept her alive through 20 years of running would keep her alive through the one time she had meant to spend herself with the rest. Her ore hauler held, wedged in its rock, when the ships of better people than her did not. She sat in the dark of it, in the sudden terrible quiet after, and listened to the last signals of her 16 crews go out one at a time, each of them a name she had made herself learn, and she did the arithmetic she had sworn she was not the kind of person to do, and found that she was, because the convoy was through. 4,000 people were across the straits and scattering into open space beyond any squadron's catching, and the price of them was 16 ships and the woman who had spent them sitting alive in the wreckage, which was the one outcome she had not had the imagination to dread. "You got them through," Terrace said, from somewhere in the dark of the hauler, "alive too, the two of them absurdly, unbearably alive." "Cass. You got them through." "I know," Cass said. "Say their names with me." "The crews. We're going to say all of them, right now, while I can still hear them, and then we're going to carry them, because that's what you do with people you spend. You carry them. Start with the Marta's Grace. Start with mine." Far ahead, in the open space beyond the straits, the convoy from Weller's Reach did not know yet what it had cost to be there, and would spend years learning it, and here is the only part of this story that is not about a trap. There were 4,000 and some aboard those overloaded hulls, and they were nobody, farmers and shift workers and a schoolmaster and 3 midwives and a great many children and a man who had brought, against all sense, a crate of apple cuttings from a world he would never see again because someone, somewhere, was going to want to grow apples. They crossed into the open and felt the ship steady under them as the acceleration eased, and the ones who understood what that meant, that they had made it, that the pursuit was gone, began, in the quiet way of frightened people who have been holding their breath for hours, to let themselves believe it. They did not celebrate. That is the thing the Accord would never have understood, watching them, if the Accord had been watching. There was no single moment where the convoy, as one, exhaled. It came to them separately, in 4,000 separate ways, in 10,000 separate rooms of the self. A woman found her sister 3 holes over on the comms and could not speak. A father counted his children twice. The man with the apple cuttings checked that the crate had survived and put his forehead against it and stayed there a while. Each of them met the fact of their survival alone, and carried it alone, the enormous private weight of having lived when the cost of it was still being paid behind them in the dark, and no two of them carried it the same way, and there was no bell that rang to make them one grateful thing. Belle Ostrander, one of the 3 midwives, spent the first hour of the open sky checking a list she had kept the whole crossing, a list of every pregnancy aboard the 10 hulls she had made it her business to know, and found all of them still living, and sat down on a crate in a corridor afterward and cried for exactly 4 minutes by her own count, alone, because there was no one else on her hull who understood yet what 4 unbroken minutes on that list were worth, and then she got up and went back to work, because the list did not finish itself simply because it had survived one crossing. Dena Okoye, a shift worker who had spent the whole of the pullback below decks with her hands over her youngest's ears so the boy would not hear what the hull's plating was doing, did not learn until the second day that her brother's ship had been one of the 16 left behind at the throat, and grieved it privately, in a corner of a cargo bay, in the 20 minutes she could steal between watches, and then went back to her post, because the convoy still needed its watches kept, and grief, among Weller's Reach's own people, had never once been the kind of thing you got to keep from your work for long. That was what Cass had spent her crews to protect. Not a people. 4,000 separate people, each their own room, each their own weight, scattering now into a galaxy too large to catch them all, exactly because they had never been the single catchable thing the Accord's whole science assumed they were. The convoy did not know Cass Iliff's name. Most of them never would. But the man with the apple cuttings planted them, years later, on a world with a real sky, and told the children who asked that the trees came from Weller's Reach, and that some people he never met had held a door open in the dark so the cuttings could cross, and that you did not get to know most of the names of the people who kept you alive, and should carry them anyway, all the ones you could not name. Velan Sar got the rest of his squadron out, the ships that had not been committed to the throat, the 2/3 of his strength that his own last-second horror had held back on the near side of the door. It was the only decision of the day he was proud of, and he was not very proud of it, because a tactician does not get much credit for saving the ships he had not yet fed into his own mistake. He did not pursue the convoy. There was no catching it now. it was through the straits and scattering, and the only fast passage was a canyon full of his own dead and the rock that had come down on them. He held his surviving ships at the mouth of the throat for a long time, longer than doctrine wanted, because a marshal looks at what he has done, and Tsar made himself look, at the ruin of his lead division sealed in the dark with the wrecks of the ships that had sealed it, 16 light human hulls that had closed a door on 30 heavy ones and mostly died doing it. Damsel found him there, still on the bridge, long after the watch had turned over twice, and did not say anything for a while, because a good flag captain knows when a silence is doing more work than a sentence could. "Reckoner," Damsel said at last. "The squadron will want orders." "The squadron will have them," Tsar said, "as soon as I understand what I am ordering them out of." Damsel studied him a moment with an oryx's flat, patient attention, and then said the only thing that was both true and useful. "You held back the 2/3. Whatever else happened here, 4,000 of my people and I are going to want to remember that you did that, when the history of today gets written by someone who was not here to see it." Tsar did not find it comforting. He found it accurate, and filed it away the way he filed everything, and it changed nothing about what he still had to do alone in his cabin. And then he went to his cabin, and he sat down with the battle board, and he ran the whole engagement back from the beginning, because that was the discipline, and because he needed to know exactly where he had lost it, and the answer was worse than a mistake. He had made no mistake. That was the thing he sat with, alone, through the long watches. He ran his reading back move by move and every move was correct. The throat was open, he had read it open. The flotilla pulled back, he had read a withdrawal. The commander could not hold the passage, she could not hold the passage. Every single piece of his reading was true, and the reading was still fatally wrong, because underneath all the true pieces sat one assumption that was not a reading at all, that the enemy wanted to live, and that assumption had been correct in every engagement of his life and every engagement in the histories he had studied and every engagement his whole science was built on, and it had been false here, and the falseness of it had swallowed his lead division whole. He went back, too, to the intelligence file he had trusted at 600 marks, the one line about the enemy commander that had reassured him more than any disposition on the board, a smuggler, elevated to command by attrition, 20 years spent running rather than fighting, a woman by every documented habit of her life devoted to her own survival above all things. He had read that line as proof. He understood now that he had read it exactly backward. A smuggler does not survive 20 years of evading the accord by being reckless with her own life. That much of the file had been true, but survival is a habit, not a nature, and a habit is a thing a person can set down the one time it stops being useful to them. She had spent 2 decades learning exactly how a reckoner tactician thought, so that on the one day it mattered she could hand him the version of herself he already expected to see, and let him walk the rest of the way into the mistake unassisted. It was, Tsar thought, with the specific vertigo of a man admiring the very tool that had gutted him, the single most elegant piece of tactics he had witnessed in a long career devoted to elegance, and he could not decide, sitting with it, whether that made it easier to bear or considerably worse. The enemy commander had not outthought him. He could have survived being outthought. She had done something his science had no defense against. She had made a decision he could not model, because his model had no term for it. She had decided her ships did not need to survive. And from that one decision, which no rational enemy in the Accord's entire experience had ever made, the entire trap had unfolded with perfect logic, every piece of it reading exactly as self-preservation right up until the moment it turned out to be self-sacrifice wearing self-preservation's clothes. He understood, sitting there, that he had not been beaten by a better tactician. He had been beaten by his own certainty, handed back to him as a weapon. The commander had not needed to be cleverer than Villain Tsar. She had only needed to know the one thing Villain Tsar was so sure of that he could not see it, and to build a door out of it, and to wait for him to walk through his own deepest assumption into the dark. He sat with that understanding for the better part of a watch before he let himself move, because a discipline that only holds when the news is good is not a discipline at all, and SAR had spent a lifetime insisting to junior officers that the worst hour to abandon your own rigor is the hour it has just failed you. So he wrote the report. Not the tactical after-action, which was simple and which someone else could file: ships lost, passage denied, convoy escaped. He wrote the other thing, the thing that had no form and that he had to invent a form for, because it was too important to leave in the plain report and too dangerous to say out loud in a wardroom. He classified it as a hazard. Doctrinal hazard, he wrote, of the first order. The enemy is able to weaponize the foundational assumption of our tactical science, that an opponent acts to preserve itself. Against this enemy, that assumption is not reliable and must be treated as a vulnerability rather than a tool. I was not outmaneuvered. I was read. They knew what I was certain of, and they built the engagement out of my certainty, and I walked my lead division into it move by correct move. I do not know how to teach around this. Our entire tactical doctrine assumes an enemy that wants to live. I have met one that, at need, does not, and I have no doctrine for it, and neither does anyone, and I am filing this so that the next tactician who faces them at least knows that the ground he is standing on is the trap. He considered, before signing it, whether to restrict its circulation to the tactical corps alone, where a small guild of professionals might absorb the finding without panic. It would have been the easier road, and no rule of his order required him to take the harder one. But a hazard unclassified past the desks that most needed it was not a hazard flagged at all, only a secret dressed up as caution, and SAR had spent a life despising exactly that dressed-up secrecy in other men's reports. He marked it for the widest distribution his rank allowed, knowing as he did it that the note would eventually reach the same guild halls the Accord's reckoners answered to, and that somewhere in those halls a stranger's honest sentence would come to sit beside whatever else had already been quietly filed about a species no one yet knew how to fight. He signed it. He looked at it for a long time. And Velan SAR, who had begun the day with the guilty pleasure of a man who had never misread an enemy, ended it understanding that his gift and his blindness were the same thing, that the elegance he loved was the exact surface the enemy had needed, and that somewhere out in the scattering dark there was a commander carrying 16 ships worth of dead who had understood him better than he understood himself, and had loved her people enough to spend them, and had never once, not for a second, wanted to live more than she wanted them through. I asked you to hold one thing in your mind as the range closed, and now that the door is shut and the dust is down, let me tell you why it mattered. Velan SAR was the best reader of enemies the Accord had, and he was not defeated by a better one. He was defeated by the floor of his own science, the assumption so deep that a lifetime of being right had made it invisible, that a thinking enemy, at bottom, acts to preserve itself. It is a good assumption. It is true of nearly everything that has ever fought a war, because nearly everything that fights a war is a single thing that can want, as one, to survive. The Accord had built 100,000 years of tactics on it and never once been failed by it, because the Accord had never fought a people that was not, underneath, one wanting thing. And Cass Iliff was not a hero, and would have laughed in your face if you called her one, and did in effect laugh, bitterly, alone, in the wreck of an ore hauler with 16 ships worth of names to carry. She did not win because she was cleverer than SAR. She won because she knew the one thing he was too certain of to see, and because she was the kind of enemy his certainty had no term for, a commander who had already decided, before the first shot, that her ships did not need to come home. It was a monstrous thing to decide. It was a butcher's arithmetic and she knew it and she did it anyway, because 4,000 people needed a door held open in the dark, and there was no version of holding it that let her keep her 16 crews, and she had chosen the 4,000, and she carried the 16 the rest of her life for having the right to choose it all. The Accord would file it as a tactical loss, a passage denied, a convoy that got away, the small change of a border war. But Veland Sar filed the other thing, the hazard note, the one that said our certainty can be used against us, and it went up the chain the way those things go, and it joined, though Sar would never know it, a quiet and growing collection of documents from across the frontier, each one filed by someone who had met the humans and come back knowing something the Accord could not afford to know. A reckoner's empty box. A salvage crew's 4 words. A marshal's blank fold line. A scholar's sealed monograph. And now a tactician's hazard note, which said the most dangerous thing of all, the thing that turned an anomaly into a threat, that the ungovernable trait of these people was not just that they could not be folded, but that they knew it, and could aim it, and would spend themselves without limit to make it cost. The convoy scattered into the open and lived. Cass Iliffe carried her dead. And Veland Sar spent the rest of a shortened career trying to teach around a hole in his science that could not be taught around, because the hole was the shape of an enemy that did not want, as one, to live, and a galaxy whose every certainty was built on the opposite had just been handed the first proof that its certainties were now a weapon in someone else's hands.